Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and first of all, I'm really sorry that there was no episode that went live last week. I'm not entirely sure what happened there. I guess it was a problem on my part. I didn't hit a button, so I'm sorry that this didn't go live when it was supposed to. However, we're here now, so let's talk about learning to preserve food, because that's one of those homesteading skills that can easily be learned in a suburban setting. And as we, rapidly learned by going through and practicing and learning these homesteading skills, we have definitely learned from some mistakes along the way when it comes to preserving food. So let's dig in and talk about some of those learnings that we had. So the first one is jars that we actually need, right? When we first started canning and practicing homesteading skills, we started by stocking up on lots of different jars. So we had half pints, quarts, even half-gallon jars, both in standard or regular mouth size jars and the wide mouth. And one of the things that we learned super early in the process was we don't actually need all of these types of jars. We only really needed a couple of them. And the ones that we use all the time are the regular mouth pint jars and the wide mouth quart jars. That's it. The half gallons, they might be used for juice once we move to our new homestead and we get apple picking. But right now they've been relegated to storing seeds. So I've used them as mini seed vaults with different seed packets to store, or I've been using them as a store for drying beans. So my husband and I were shelling a couple of 5-gallon buckets of drying beans that we had, that we'd saved from the previous year, and we've been just shelling them into these half-gallon jars and stuff. So we haven't really used our half-gallon jars, although somebody on the Facebook group has had the great idea of that's what she stores broth from chickens in. So that's a good option for you. However, we realised that those size jars and all the other jars that we have, the half pints and stuff, the little jelly jars and stuff, we don't really use them. The majority of stuff for us is in quarts or pints. And like I said, we use the wide mouth quarts and the regular mouth pints. So those are the ones that we would stock up on moving forward. I mean, for the half pints, well, folks, let me tell you that there really absolutely is such a thing as too many jams and jellies. Seriously, there's things that we canned 5 years ago and we haven't used. And now we actually have to empty the jars and clean them out ready for us to move. And that brings me rather nicely on to our next lesson learned, which is quantity matters. So along with 100 jams, jars of jam or pepper jelly that we've not used, we have 1,000 jars of chutney, because I went way overboard on chutney. What is chutney, I hear you ask? Well, it's a sweet and tangy condiment, right? It pairs really well with cheese boards, cold meat, and in a cheese sandwich. That's commonly how I have it, is in a cheese sandwich. Well, now it's a vegan cheese sandwich. But, it's well known in the UK. It is not well known here in the US, which makes it incredibly hard to give out as gifts because nobody knows what it is and what to do with it. So when I've given chutney out to people, I've usually given, a list of ideas to use the chutney on. My husband really likes it with a bit of pork pie if he's made pork pie and stuff. But now I don't eat meat, there's not a lot that I really use chutney for. Maybe I'll add it on top of a curry just to give it a little bit of a different dynamic. But realistically, it is really difficult to come up with different uses for chutney. And I don't have just zucchini chutney. I have also known as courgette chutney. I also have green tomato chutney and various other types of chutney kicking about. So one of the lessons that we learned very rapidly was that just because you have a recipe and you have enough ingredients to make like a million jars of chutney or pickles or relish or jam or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should. Right? If it's a new recipe or a new condiment that you've not tried before, like corn relish is one that's often in the canning books, and I've never had it before. If you've never had it before, just do a small batch. So most of the recipes that are given are for 6 jars, maybe 10 jars at the most, right? Don't double up the recipe, don't triple up the recipe, don't do 40 runs of it in the canner because you've got enough ingredients to be able to do that. I wish that I had stuck to the small batch, especially with the pepper jelly. My husband said that they were good for glazing meat, and I made one batch of them, and they have sat all alone, and I have used exactly 1 jar since I made them, and they don't get used. Even ones that were opened up and used sat in the back of the fridge for months and months waiting to be used. So I would definitely say that if it is a new recipe and you're not sure of it, do it as a small batch. Don't make any more than what the recipe entails, and try it and see if there's different ways that you can use it. And if you don't like it, see about giving it away to friends, family, neighbors, and see if they can use it, rather than having it just kind of sitting around and not being used. Because that's the really frustrating thing that I've found is we've canned all this stuff and it's just sat there and it's not been used, which leads me on to lesson number 3. Keep the produce in sight. So the old saying, out of sight, out of mind, right? Well, if your home canned produce remains out of sight, it might be forgotten. So make it a habit to add it, your home canned goods, to your meal plan, so it will get used, or periodically make a plan to, bring things up from wherever you're storing it, into the pantry, so you'll see it and you will use it. Because that's what's happened with us. Ours is kind of sat in the basement on the shelves, and it's been forgotten about because, we're busy doing other things, or, it's just been behind the 1,000,001 jars of chutney that were there, right? So as we've been kind of packing up our home from moving, we've started finding stuff. I found pickles and jams and all of these weird things that we made and we never got round to using, which was kind of disappointing. And I sort of remembered back from when I was younger and still living in the UK, Grandad and Granny had a shed. Well, it was the garage. The garage. And they had shelves in there that were full of different pickles and stuff. And they sat there and they rotated through them, but they had way more than they could ever use, and things were constantly given out for stuff. And my granny had these amazing spiced pears in syrup, and they were my favorite thing in the world. And I was talking to my sister not so long ago, and I was like, do you remember those? She's like, yeah, I do. And I was trying to remember the spices and things that were in it, because I have my grandmother's pickling and canning recipes, but I can't find the one for the spiced pears. So we're trying to remember between us what the spices were in there. So I'm going to have a bit of experimenting to do. But again, I don't want to do it in such a big quantity that, if it's something that, I don't like, I've got no way of using it. I have put pickles and jams and, chutneys into the compost, dump them out and then, turned everything in the compost. And, it has broken down, but I really don't recommend that as being a resolution. Stick with the smaller batches, figure out if it is a recipe that you like and one that you are going to use. And remember that your needs are going to change. So your go-to recipes for canning and needs for canning on your homestead are going to change and develop as your skills develop and you get more confident. So for example, we started with jams and jellies and chutney, right? They were things that were familiar. They were things that I'd made with my granny. Like I knew how to do them. The recipes were simple and we had tons of blackberries and stuff, right? We then stepped up into a pressure canner. Now we can meat, veggies, soups, stews, stocks and broths, and we make midweek meals of, farmer's soup, as we call it, or a stew that are perfect for last minute, like midweek meals, right? Our canning needs have changed and our needs have evolved as our skills of growing food in the garden have developed too. So now we make things like passata or homemade pasta sauce, pickled green beans with spicy peppers, or even quarts of canned chili when we have lots of beans and peppers, right? The fruits do so much better as being frozen fruits where we can use them in desserts, smoothies, or just added to oatmeal rather than being made into jam, right? Our taste for food have changed and so has our method that we choose to preserve the harvest. And that's okay. This is part of that journey of learning and honing your skills as a homestead. And this is why it's great when you are homesteading in the suburbs, because you're able to, do these kind of things without it being, like the be all and end all, right? If you're living in the middle of nowhere on 140 acres, hypothetically, right, and all that you've got is 1,000 jars of, chutney, and the nearest grocery store is a 4-hour drive away, well, I'm gonna be eating chutney for a while, right? So there's different methods to preserve harvests and stuff, and there's different ways that we can use it. So zucchini is a really great example, right? Remember that we made it into chutney, lots of jars of chutney. Now we will freeze the excess of zucchini, right? We will turn it into zucchini lasagna, right? So you use the zucchini as the lasagna sheets rather than the pasta. So rather than turning it into another batch of chutney, we will turn the zucchini into zucchini lasagna, and then we will freeze it for an easier family meal, right? The more we have lived as homesteaders in the suburbs, the more we have learned about how the homestead pieces fit together with us as a family. So, finding out, hey, these recipes we really, really like, right? We love Italian food. We eat Italian food all the time. So making our own pasta sauce with tomatoes that we grew was a total no-brainer because we use it all the time. So, this is kind of feeding into the development plan of, what it is that we're going to be doing on our new homestead. And that's going to be an upcoming episode where we're going to be talking about some of those things. But, it's okay to make mistakes on your homestead because they're not necessarily mistakes. They're lessons to learn. And that's how we develop. And that's how, our skills get better. My other big lesson for me was planning my canning days. And, I work full time outside of doing the podcast and the blog and stuff. I have a full-time job. And, as best as you can, try to plan the days that you're going to be preserving and canning, right? You can kind of guesstimate based on the days to maturity of the plants, right? Remember that garden journal for taking notes? It comes in really handy. But you can, based on when you planted a variety, if you know the days to maturity because you've taken notes, you can figure out when you expect a harvest to begin. And, I would make a note of those days, put it as a memo, put it on the calendar, something so you don't forget about, when it's going to be. And then see about getting some help. I knew that the tomatoes were going to be coming in around, middle of August. And I always kind of had vacation days or PTO kind of, sort of tentatively planned out for around when I would expect the tomatoes to be coming in, because I knew I was going to need to be, harvesting and canning. But one of the things that, I learned early was that, canning, is way better when there's more people helping and you can hang out and do stuff, right? So reach out to friends and see if they'd be willing to do a potluck and help you can and preserve, right? You get to spend time with friends and preserve, and it's a winner, right? Canning days can be really tough. They are definitely incredibly busy, right? Between my husband and I, right, when we're doing canning, one of us is cleaning and sanitizing, the other one's prepping the ingredients or heating the ingredients on the stove, right? One of us is probably filling jars, the other is then wiping the rims and screwing on the lids, right? Whilst the canner's coming up to temperature or pressure, right? One of us is monitoring that, getting ready to start the timer. The other one of us is cleaning and sanitizing in the kitchen to get started on the next batch, right? There's a lot of collaboration in homesteading, and preserving or canning your produce out of the garden is no exception. So don't be afraid to ask for help, especially if you've got a lot that needs to be taken care of and you don't want to make it all into pickles, right? Having, friends there to help, right? It makes it a lot more enjoyable, right? I know people who would try and do canning like before work and stuff, and that just wasn't going to work for us as a family. But I would definitely do a canning session when I got home from work. But then, I'd be heading to bed around like 11:30, and it was just exhausting to be trying to be mentally awake enough to do a full day at work as well. So, try and plan as best as you can, and, see if you can get friends over to help. Like some friends, might even have a canner, and, you can be working multiple batches at the same time. So, see who's available. And you never know who would be interested in helping you, or at least just chilling out and spending time together, right? All right. The next lesson that I learned was planning your garden. So I may have alluded to this just a little bit when talking about the needs of the homestead changing, right? When you're considering what to can and preserve, this is something that you should really sit down and discuss as a family when you're planning your garden. So for example, my homestead, like I mentioned, we eat a lot of Italian food. We go through tomatoes like water runs through sand. And as such, we try to plan out how many jars of pasta sauce, for example, we would use in a year. Let's say we use 52 quart-sized jars of pasta sauce in a year. We would look up a recipe for pasta sauce in quarts and see how many tomatoes we would need, right? And then we use that information to start to plan out approximately how many tomato plants we would need. So I know growing here in Utah in my garden that I need between 18 and 25 tomato plants growing to produce enough tomatoes to keep us in pasta sauce for that year, right? Then we plan out the garden since we know how many plants we need for the space that we have available. So why is it 18 to 25 plants? Well, 18 plants would be the rockstar veggies that, the varieties that grow well in our region, in my garden. Those that have consecutively produced a reliable harvest. We would add in a couple of plants here and there of new varieties that we were trying, and if we have brand new varieties, then we would plant a bunch of extra plants to account for losing some with disease, pests, or they don't ripen or produce fruit in the growing season that we have. So having that garden journal and taking notes about how well things have produced a harvest, typical yields, those kind of things, those have really helped hone in how the garden is going to look. Now, of course, moving to a different homestead completely, it's kind of starting from scratch, right? I've got to figure out, like, these are the varieties that are growing. This is what's growing. This is kind of the harvest that I can expect in the timing that I have, and then start to figure out what the canning and the growing plan is going to look like. So there you have it, some lessons that we have learned with canning, right? Don't make the mistakes that that we made and that I definitely made in, producing too much when it comes to canning, because there really is such a thing as having too much of something. And start small. There's no nothing wrong with starting small and getting confidence in your skills and getting used to using some of these ingredients and things in different recipes, especially when it comes to condiments, right? There's not a lot that you can use them for unless you're incredibly creative in the kitchen. So, start small, learn how to use what it is that you're canning, right? And, don't be afraid if it didn't work out, right? Sometimes these things don't happen, and we've got to be good to ourselves. This isn't necessarily a mistake, but it's definitely a lesson to learn, and at least it's only being done on a small scale, and you can always keep practicing and keep honing your skills. And I encourage you to do so. Like, keep persevering, because that's how you really earn the badge of being a homesteader, is persevering, keeping at it, and even when things don't work out right, coming up with another solution. So I want to hear from you. What are some of the lessons learned from canning that you've made? Let me know in the Facebook group. Until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I will see you all next week.